gefnogi'r streic yma ran gweithwyr yn y sector gyhoeddus yn Sir Gaerfyrddin. Ac allai ar y dechrau llongyfarch bod cymaint o chi wedi dod yma i fynychu y rali yma. Roedd fy nad wrth gwrs yn siop steward cyn iddo ymddeol gyda undeb y trydanwyr. A'i gyfenw oedd John Strike. Nhw'n dweud i fi, dim ond unwaith nath e byth trefnu strike. My father, when he was a meter reader, was a shop steward with the Electricians Union, and his nickname was John Strike. Although he only told me, he tells me he only ever organised one strike, so I'm very pleased to be following in a proud family tradition. I'm delighted to be here with you today in solidarity. And yesterday during Prime Minister's questions, I told the Prime Minister that I would be here with you today showing my support. Now, despite being second on the order paper, Ed Miliband, the leader of the Labour Party, had his 6 questions before I spoke. And in not one of those questions did he say that he would be supporting the 1.5 million striking workers across the UK today. We need the Labour Party to be supporting small parties like Plaid and the trade unions in rejecting Tory austerity. And the big question is, where are they? I also attacked the Prime Minister in my question his plans now to ban public sector workers from striking. And I told him that withdrawing labour for workers is a basic human right. Mae'n hawl dynol sylfaenol. My first major speech was at the Plaid Cymru Spring Conference, soon after being selected to stand for Plaid Cymru in Carmarthen East in 2010, it was April. And although some might say that I had fortune-telling abilities, I said in that speech that the political right, and I mean that in the widest possible context in terms of Westminster, it's not just the Tories, it's all the parties in Westminster, would use the deficit that had accumulated following the banking crash as an excuse to shrink the state. And what we're going through at the moment is a declaration of war, of course, on the public sector. It's an ideological policy drive supported by all the 3 parties. There's no difference at all in the election manifestos those 3 parties stood on in 2010. And indeed, the Financial Times this week said that the election next year will be fought on variations of austerity. Westminster is an extremely strange place. Only a handful of MPs out of the 650 MPs that are there in Westminster voted against the welfare reform bill. 22 of us voted against the welfare reform bill, which brought in the malicious policy such as the bedroom tax. The Labour Party abstained on that one. Only earlier this year, only 20 MPs voted against the welfare cap, and the Labour Party voted with the Tories. And as I was saying, the next election again will be the 3 parties signed up to the same austerity policy. Not a penny difference in their fiscal plans. The Labour Party is saying already that they're going to copy the Tory fiscal policy. Austerity, of course, has failed on its own terms, and it's sobering to think that we're not even half of the way through those cuts that were announced in the emergency budget in 2010 and the subsequent comprehensive spending bill. We're not even half of the way through, and further cuts have been announced to follow it. As I was saying, austerity has failed on its own terms. It was meant to eliminate the deficit in one parliamentary term. We're only a third of the way towards achieving that aim. And the reason for that, of course, is, as I was prophesying at the time, significant public investment cuts will suck demand out of the general economy. That's what's happened. The deficit targets have been missed by a country mile, and the debt levels have increased substantially. Instead, of course, we should be investing in our public services. We should be increasing expenditure, particularly in infrastructure projects which create jobs. We should be introducing a living wage, which would save money for the Treasury, but there wouldn't be the jobs subsidy that currently exists. And what do we see in Carmarthenshire? The Council bringing forward policies to reduce trade union facilitation time. Again, the same part of the agenda to curb those that stand up against these vicious threats. We need to boost the private sector in Carmarthenshire. There's no doubt about that. I talk often about that when I have the opportunity in the House of Commons. But it's not an either-or situation. We should be proud of our public sector and the vital economic and social contribution they make to our community. Instead, what we've got, of course, in Westminster is economic policy back to the same old boom and bust model. Consumer spending is already up to 100% of GVA. The another house price bubble being deliberately stimulated, particularly in London and the South East. It's business as usual for the financial elite in the city of London, and they're doing extremely well out of it. As I have said many times in the media, and indeed in the House of Commons, we should have followed Iceland. We should have jailed the bankers and squibs and bailed out the people. And instead, what we have got is the complete opposite. The bankers and the financial elite being rewarded for failure, systematic failure and corruption on their behalf, and the public sector and the most vulnerable in our society paying the price for their economic mistakes. I'd like to close just with this brief statement, which is what I've been issuing to the press today in response to these strikes. Whether it's the fight for a living wage, opposing cuts to frontline services, protecting jobs, supporting our teachers, keeping fire stations open, or defending trade union facilitation time, Plaid Cymru has always been and always will be on the side of the workforce. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next up is Ken Smith.